possible that space exploration may result in an opportunity to confront God and ask a few questions? Andre Malraux, prolific author and social commentator, decades ago said that the 21st century would be the bloodiest in the history of humankind, and the conflicts would all revolve around God. In George Steiner's autobiography, he wonders whether there has ever been a ruler leading people into battle under the banner of agnosticism. We at Food for Thought Productions decided to shed a little light on agnosticism, and who better to do that than Robert Greene Ingersoll, popular orator of the 19th century, famously known as the Great Agnostic. Ingersoll was a devoted family man, saying the home and family hearth was more to be worshipped than any church altar. Our guests for this program include Scott Plune, an educator and social worker who did extensive research on Ingersoll, as did Richard McNally, a talented actor who has developed a one-man show called The Great Agnostic, which we'll be seeing part of today. Here they are with our producer, Lee Baker.
And helping Scott and me, Scott, really do justice to Ingersoll, because we've discussed his ideas and so forth, but you're going to lend us your voice to say Ingersoll's words as we go along,
Hope
right?
to bring him alive.
Well, that's what we're going to do. So anyway, it's kind of interesting how we all got interested in this man who was so far ahead of his time, 150 years ago. And in a minute, you give a little brief about him.
He was born in 1833. He lived until 1899. And he was born a son of a Presbyterian minister, and who was also very good at speaking. Ingersoll was very known for his oratory, did a lot of speaking. And his family moved around a lot. He was born in New York State. They moved to New York City. His father was a revivalist and very much tried to get people enthused about Christianity. And he wouldn't stay anywhere too long because he's kind of specialized in getting people all stirred up.
Stirred up and left. Went to the next town.
Handed them somebody else.
So, you know, I was reading after you got me started, and I started with the internet, one thing and another, and I read that he, with all his traveling, his formal education was only in what they call grammar school then, elementary
Then it was
school.
kind of hit and miss.
Right.
As he moved around with his father.
As he moved around, so it's pretty well
He eventually got a law degree.
Mm-hmm.
Which was easier to do in those days. I think you just studied up and took a test.
That's right. That's what, like Abraham Lincoln did the same thing. He only had
He and his brother both got law degrees. Older brother.
Right, Clark, and his brother Clark became a congressman from Peoria.
This panel discussion, to be presented in its entirety on a future program, led to Richard McNally's one-man show as The Great Agnostic.
Let me hereby declare to you that I consider the views of the atheist and the agnostic to be one and the same. Others have said that I am a disbeliever, that I refuse to believe. Of course, it would be just as reasonable to speak of a person refusing to like a certain kind of food as to speak of refusing to believe a certain thing. Both belief and unbelief are results of testimony. If in the testimony there is sufficient evidence, the reason accepts and belief results. If in the testimony there is insufficient evidence, the reason does not accept and unbelief results. The will is not a factor in the process. So, now that I've opened that can of worms, let's move on. Most of us will celebrate the upcoming year 1900 as the turn of the century. It's also a presidential election year, and as many of you may know, I have lots of experience in presidential elections. In fact, whatever national prominence I've achieved in my 65 years can be traced back to the Republican National Convention of 1876. Oh, I'd made a small name for myself up to that time in the Midwest, but that convention is what really put me in the national spotlight, for a few years anyway. You see, I was living in Peoria, Illinois at the time. I had a pretty good reputation as a small-town country lawyer, and I'd been active in Republican politics for several years. Oh, I'd even been an Illinois Attorney General for a few years after the war. Tried to get elected to governor, but I was only a colonel, and Major General John Palmer cleaned my clock. However, I did manage to help my brother Clark get reelected to the United States Congress. I also made some speeches for Ulysses S. Grant, but it was at that Republican National Convention in 1876 where I was handed the honor of nominating James G. Blaine of Maine for the Republican nomination, candidate for president. Must have sounded all right, too. Whoops. Here's what the paper said about me. This is the next day. They said, Chicago Times, June 16th, 1876. The nomination of Blaine was the passionately dramatic scene of the day. Robert G. Ingersoll had been fixed upon to present Blaine's tune to the convention, and a more effective champion could not have been selected in the whole party conclave. Ingersoll advanced to the central stage. As he walked forward, the thundering cheers, sustained and swelling, never ceased. Ingersoll waited with unimpaired serenity and then began an appeal, impassioned, artful, brilliant, and persuasive. Goes on and ends up like this. Words can do but meager justice to the wizard power of this extraordinary man. He swayed and moved and impelled and restrained and worked in all ways with the mass before him, as if he possessed some key to the innermost mechanism that moves the human heart. And when he finished, his fine, frank face as calm as when he began, the overwrought thousands sank back in exhaustion and an unspeakable wonder and delight. All turned out to be an exercise in futility, though. The convention leaders who were opposed to Blaine made up some cock and bull story about gas lights that were on the fritz, and they adjourned right after my speech. By the time we came back the next morning, my speech was all but forgotten, and they nominated Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio as their candidate. I was so mad I almost quit the Republican Party. In fact, in 1879, my fellow free thinker and I, Thaddeus Burr Wakeman, we tried to establish a third party. Our main objectives were the divorce of church and state, the divorce of church and school, the taxation of all private property, and the repeal of all laws abridging work for one day in the week, and laws denying to any man any civil right on account of his belief or unbelief. But our efforts came to nothing, and I remained a Republican. However, I've never quite managed to regain the enthusiasm I had back in 1876. I look back on that nomination speech as a highlight of my public speaking career. Of course, by that time, I was used to speaking in public. I'd already been a practicing trial lawyer for 22 years. I represented several Illinois railroads and must admit I made a lot of money, usually $25,000 to $50,000 a year. Not bad for the son of an itinerant Calvinist Orthodox preacher. My mother had died when I was 2, and my father didn't remarry again for 17 years. The only formal education I ever had was in grammar school, and that was rather hit and miss. My father did, though, teach us all to read, read, read. From an early age, I simply did not believe in eternal punishment and all the other teachings of Orthodox Christianity. I gave my first anti-theological lecture in 1860, which I titled Progress. By the time the war started, I was a dyed-in-the-wool agnostic. Although I eventually became a Republican, I ran for Congress as a Democrat in 1860. I was soundly defeated. I think it was because of my opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act. I had strongly denounced it in several speeches. Now, in spite of that defeat, I'll always remember 1860 as the happiest of my life. That's the year I met my wife-to-be, Eva Parker. She was the daughter of a family of freethinkers. Not quite 2 years later, on February 13th, 1862, yes, ladies, I always remember my anniversary, we were married. A few days after that, I was ordered to the Western War Theater. My war experience is fairly drab compared to most. I spent the last 3 months of 1861 raising 3 cavalry regiments, and in December of that year, we were mustered into the regular Federal Army. I was now Colonel Robert Ingersoll, 11th Cavalry, Illinois Volunteers. In 1862, we fought in the Battle of Shiloh in April, and in December, I was captured by Confederate troops. I was a prisoner for 3 months, finally released in a prisoner exchange, resigned my commission, and returned home to my 2 Avas. In September that year, the first of our 2 daughters had been born. Eva Robert Ingersoll, and just over a year later, October of '64, Maud Robert Ingersoll arrived. As with all parents, they've been the joy of my life ever since. In 1872, I began my major assault on the fortress of theology. That was the year I wrote The Gods. Here's how it starts out. An honest God is the noblest work of man. Each nation has created a God, and the God has always resembled his creators. He hated and loved what they hated and loved, and he was invariably found on the side of those in power. Each God was intensely patriotic and detested all nations but his own. All these gods demanded praise, flattery, and worship. Most of them were pleased with sacrifice, and the smell of innocent blood has ever been considered a divine perfume. All these gods have insisted upon having a vast number of priests, and the priests have always insisted upon being supported by the people. And the principal business of these priests has been to boast about their God and to insist that he could easily vanquish all the other gods put together. Most of these gods were revengeful, savage, lustful, and ignorant. As they generally depended upon their priests for information, their ignorance can hardly excite our astonishment. None of these gods could give a true account of the creation of this little earth. All were woefully deficient in geology and astronomy. Of course, they have always been partial to the people who created them, and have generally shown their partiality by assisting those people to rob and destroy others and to ravish their wives and daughters. All that is necessary, it seems to me, to convince any reasonable person that the Bible is simply and purely of human invention, of barbarian invention, is to read it as you would any other book. Get the bandage of reverence from your eyes. Drive from your heart the phantom of fear. Push from the throne of your brain the cowled form of superstition. Then read the Holy Bible, and you will be amazed that you ever, for one moment, supposed a being of infinite wisdom, goodness, and purity to be the author of such ignorance and such atrocity. The people are beginning to think, to reason, and to investigate. Slowly, painfully, but surely, the gods are being driven from the earth. Only upon rare occasions are they, even by the most religious, supposed to interfere in the affairs of men. Now and then they kill a child. As a rule, they've given up causing accidents on railroads, exploding boilers, and bursting kerosene lamps. Cholera, yellow fever, and smallpox are still considered heavenly weapons, but measles, itch, and ague are now attributed to natural causes. As a general thing, the gods have stopped drowning children, except as a punishment for violating the Sabbath. They will pay some attention to the affairs of kings, men of genius, and persons of great wealth, but ordinary people are left to shirk for themselves as best they may. In wars between great nations, the gods still interfere, but in prize fights, the man with an honest referee is most likely to win. I threw in a parable. Happening one day to see a crane waiting in quest of food, the good man pointed out to his son the perfect adaptation of the crane to get his living in that manner. "See," said he, "how his legs are formed for wading. What a long, slender bill he has. Observe how nicely he folds his feet when putting them in or drawing them out of the water. He does not cause the slightest ripple. He is thus enabled to approach the fish without giving them any notice of his arrival. My son," said he, "it is impossible to look at that bird without recognizing the design as well as the goodness of God in thus providing the means of subsistence." "Yes," replied the boy, I think I see the goodness of God, at least so far as the crane is concerned. But after all, Father, don't you think the arrangement a little tough on the fish?" The Gods goes on for several more pages. I hope some of you folks will get a chance to read the entire text one of these days. From that time to the present, I've been writing every chance I get. Individuality, published in 1873, Heretics and Heresies in 1874, Vision of War in 1876, Ghosts, and The Liberty of Man, Woman, and Child in 1877. In 1878, I gave the Christians a little break, and Eva and I toured Europe while I wrote about my favorite poet, Robert Burns. By that time, my writings and speeches were pretty well known, and I started getting a lot of fire and brimstone thrown at me by some of the more outspoken Christian leaders. Well, just this morning, as I was preparing to talk to you folks, I happened across this newspaper clipping from an 1878 interview by a reporter for the Express in Buffalo. It says, Mrs. Van Cott chastises Robert Ingersoll. This was an interview with a reporter. He says, "I see, Colonel, in an interview published this morning, Mrs. Van Cott, the revivalist, calls you a poor barking dog. Do you know her personally?" "I have never met or seen her." "Do you know the reason she applied that epithet?" "I suppose it to be the natural result of what is called vital piety. That is to say, universal love breeds individual hatred." "Do you intend making any reply to what she says?" "I have written her a note, of which this is a copy." "Mrs. Van Cott, my dear madam, were you constrained by the love of Christ to call a man who has never injured you a poor barking dog? Did you make this remark as a Christian or as a lady? Did you say these words to illustrate in some faint degree the refining influence upon woman of the religion you preach? What would you think of me if I should retort, using your language, changing only the sex of the last word? I have the honor to remain yours truly, R.G. Ingersoll." She never replied. In 1880, I wrote, "What Must We Do to Be Saved?" Some Mistakes of Moses, Some Reasons Why, and The Great Infidels. I wrote Orthodoxy and Which Way in 1884, Myth and Miracle in 1885, the same year we moved to New York. Took another crack at literary critique in 1891 by writing Liberty in Literature, Shakespeare. Shakespeare's my all-time favorite author. From then up to the present, I've published such titles as About the Holy Bible, Abraham Lincoln, The Foundations of Faith, How to Reform Mankind, The Truth, A Thanksgiving Sermon, Superstition, and just this year, The Devil and What is Religion. Now, before I break my arm patting myself on the back, I'll close with a few passages from a piece that I wrote just 3 years ago, Why I Am an Agnostic. For the most part, we inherit our opinions. Our beliefs depend on where we were born. If we had been born in Constantinople, most of us would have said, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. If our parents had lived on the banks of the Ganges, we would have been worshippers of Shiva, longing for the heaven of nirvana. The Scots are Calvinists because their fathers were. The Irish are Catholics because their fathers were. The English are Episcopalians because their fathers were. And the Americans are divided into 100 sects because their fathers were. I was raised among people who knew, who were certain. They did not reason or investigate. They had no doubts. They knew they had the truth. I supposed what I heard was true, and yet I did not believe it. I said, "It is." And then I thought, it cannot be. I was not convinced. I knew nothing of any science, nothing about the other side, nothing of the objections that had been urged against the blessed Scriptures. Of course, I had heard the ministers speak of blasphemers, of infidel wretches, of scoffers who laughed at holy things. Oh, they did not answer their arguments, but they tore their characters into shreds. And yet, in spite of all I heard, of all I read, I could not quite believe. My brain and my heart said no. Now, intelligent men whose brains have not been paralyzed by fear know the sacred story of creation was written by an ignorant savage. The story is inconsistent with all known facts, and its author was an uninspired barbarian. This unknown writer was sincere. He wrote what he believed to be true. He did the best he could. He did not claim to be inspired, but he did not pretend the story had been told to him by Jehovah. He simply stated the facts as he understood them. You can imagine my surprise, my delight, when I read the poems of Robert Burns. I read Byron, Shelley, Keats, and St. Agnes Eve. And then I read Shakespeare. I compared Romeo and Juliet with the Song of Solomon, Lear with Job, and the sonnets with the Psalms, and I found Jehovah did not understand the art of speech. By some accident, I read Volney, who shows all religions are and have been established in the same way. All had their Christs, their apostles, miracles, and sacred books. And then he asked how it is possible to decide which is the true one, a question still waiting for an answer. I read The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. He labored all his life for the good of his fellow men and did as much to found this great republic as any man who ever stood beneath our flag. He gave his thoughts about religion, about the blessed Scriptures, about the superstitions of his time. He was perfectly sincere, and what he said was kind and fair. The occupant of every Orthodox pulpit became a passionate maligner of Thomas Paine. I read Voltaire, the greatest man of his century, who did more for liberty of thought and speech than any other being, human or divine. I compared Zeno, Epicurus, and Socrates, three heathen wretches who had never heard the Old Testament or the Ten Commandments, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, three favorites of Jehovah. And I was depraved enough to think the pagans were superior to the patriarchs and to Jehovah. The cross was a symbol chiseled upon tombs many ages before a line of our Bible was written. The Eucharist was borrowed from the pagans. At the harvest festival, they made cakes of wheat and said, "This is the flesh of the goddess." They drank wine and cried, "This is the blood of our God." The Egyptians had a trinity. They worshipped Osiris, Isis, and Horus thousands of years before the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost were known. In our blessed gospel, there's nothing new, nothing original, all old, all borrowed, pieced, and patched. I concluded that all religions were the work of man. Humboldt had published his lectures, Darwin with his Origin of Species, Spencer gave his theory of evolution. Theology looked more absurd than ever. Thomas Huxley was absolutely loyal to what he thought was truth. He followed the footsteps of life from the lowest to the highest forms. Theology looked smaller still. Haeckel began at the simplest cell, went from change to change, from form to form, followed the line of development, the path of life, until he reached the human race. It was all natural. There'd been no interference from without. I read the works of these great men, of many others, and I became convinced they were right. And all the theologians, all the believers in a special creation were absolutely wrong. then I ask myself the question, is there a supernatural power, an arbitrary mind, an enthroned God, a supreme will that sways the tides and the currents of the world, to which all causes bow? I do not deny it. I do not know, but I do not believe it. Is there a God? I do not know. Is man immortal? I do not know. One thing I do know, and that is neither hope nor fear, belief nor denial can change the fact. It is as it is and will be as it must be. We wait and we hope. When I became convinced the universe is natural, all the ghosts and gods are myths, they're entered into my brain, into my soul, into every drop of my blood, the sense, the feeling, the joy of freedom. The walls of my prison crumbled and fell. The dungeon was flooded with light, and all the bolts and bars and manacles became dust. I was no longer a servant, a serf, or a slave. There was no master for me in all the world, not even in infinite space. I was free, free to think.
Robert Ingersoll died in 1899 at the home of his daughter and son-in-law, where his ashes were kept in an urn until the death of his beloved wife in 1924. At that time, the ashes of both were interred at Arlington National Cemetery. Following his death, a statue was erected in Peoria, Illinois, in honor of a favorite son who spent time in that city. Ingersoll's is a practical immortality. After 150 years, his contributions to society continue to enrich our lives. More information on the great agnostic and agnosticism is available in libraries and on the internet. We hope you have found this program intellectually stimulating and that you will continue to investigate the ideas raised here. To connect with other like-minded individuals, please contact any of the dozens of freethought organizations, such as the American Humanist Association, American Atheists, the Center for Inquiry, and Atheists United. You may also email the producer directly via leebaker27@gmail.com. This program has been distributed through the courtesy of Atheists United.